A very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues from different parts of the world. Welcome all. Let's kickstart this side event at the session on statistical framework session at the 53rd UN Statistical Commission. My name is Animesh Kumar. I'm the head of UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction based in Bonn. So I take this opportunity to welcome you all to this side event, and which focuses on disaster-related statistics for risk-informed development. The timing of this event couldn't have been any better. The IPCC Working Group 2 is meeting starting today for this whole week to consider and finalize the next report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability that will be launched next week, which bears very high significance for the disaster statistics community. The COVID-19 pandemic has just sent a stark reminder to the whole world that days of one hazard, one impact are over. And climate change is further driving risk across borders with impacts on all sectors and with long-lasting socioeconomic and environmental consequences. Looking forward, this climatic dimension will only aggravate risk over time, making transformative and early action an urgency. It is this complex nature of risk that underpins the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction and marks a refocus towards a prevention lens for disaster risk management. That is, with the underlying and firm understanding that to be sustainable, development has to be risk-informed. The adoption of a set of 7 targets backed by 38 indicators was a milestone step in this direction. The Sendai Framework Monitor, I'm very happy to inform, is currently being used by over 155 countries, half of which have reported on all targets at least once. Such a consistent level of reporting is resulting in a massive collection of official statistics on disaster risk reduction, which is unprecedented. This has redefined what is big data, resulting in several analytical reports that track progress in disaster risk reduction and resilience building. Such explosion in official statistics also calls for the need for quality assurance and data standards to ensure disaster statistics are comparable across space and time. As you are aware, the UN Statistical Commission at its 50th session requested for exploring the development of a common statistical framework on disaster-related statistics. Towards this end, an interagency and expert group, IAEG, on disaster-related statistics was established in 2021. Last year, the IAEG had its global meeting last year in May. Thereafter, the UNECE Task Force on Measuring Hazardous Events and Disasters and the IAEG organized the first global expert forum on disaster-related statistics in June last year. This year, the second such forum will be hosted by ESCAP, and you will hear more about the event from my colleague Wafa from the Commission later today. This side event itself is being organized by ESCAP and UNDRR as co-chairs of IAEG, Ricky and myself, in collaboration with other IAEG core group members, including UNECA, UNECE, ECLAC, ESCOA, and the UN Statistical Division, to bring the statistical and disaster risk reduction or DRR communities together. In these deliberations, a number of topics were discussed for a research agenda, and based on the feedback from the IAEG members and other stakeholders, 3 topics have been shortlisted for further in-depth study, which include economic losses attributed to disasters, DRR expenditure, and satellite accounting and environmental and ecosystem-related disaster losses. Thematic analysis for these areas of work are ongoing and will feed into the larger statistical framework that we seek to develop. We should also acknowledge global and system-wide efforts ongoing in strengthening the data ecosystem globally. The UN Data Strategy, associated roadmap, and ongoing efforts to develop data governance approaches are some key examples. We hope that as a community, with a very specific focus on disaster-related statistics, we will make our best contribution towards this larger endeavor. To close, I would like to thank the UN Statistical Commission for bringing this topic to the forefront of its deliberations. It's extremely critical because it provides a benchmark for the national statistical systems to have a full ownership of disaster-related statistics, thus enabling more evidence-based policy making in disaster risk reduction and development, and a comprehensive monitoring of the Sendai Framework and related SDGs. We look forward to a very interesting and exciting session to hear from our primary clients, the governments, and some of our colleagues from the UN system and other colleagues on data standards and disaggregation from different organizations. Thank you very much. And with this, I'm very pleased to hand over to the moderator of the session, Mr. Michael Nagy from UN Economic Commission for Europe, who works there as a statistician in the Environmental Multi-Domain Statistics section. Michael, over to you. I think you're muted. Michael, maybe you can try again. Seems Michael is having some connectivity issue. So while he rejoins, let me try to introduce the panel. So we have presenters from 2 countries. We will have Vivian R. Ilarina, who works as the Assistant National Statistician in the Macroeconomic Account Service in Philippines. And we'll also have Teresa Pinto, National Director of Administration and Finance from Mozambique.
And I'm back.
Great. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, and sorry for this technical issue. I hope you can hear me now. Can you confirm? Animesh, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry for this. So, okay, sorry for that. And thanks for introducing the first panelists. Yeah, just to introduce the panel. So I wanted to say, without doubt, official statistics of high quality are essential in all phases of disaster risk management. And this has also been recognized in the report of the Open-Ended Intergovernmental Expert Working Group on Indicators and Terminology, which was endorsed by the UN General Assembly in February 2017. I assume that we all know of examples where official figures on disasters have not always been available in the required quality. There is often a time lag, lack of disaggregation of information about vulnerable population groups, or even contradicting information coming from different governmental sources. The example of the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated in a quite dramatic way that the differing numbers on COVID-related deaths or infection rates are not only confusing for non-experts, but may undermine trust in official figures and can even lead to decision-making with alternative facts instead of using evidence-based information. Differences in official figures does not necessarily mean that they're contradicting each other, but they may mean different things based on different data sets, different methodological approaches, differently used terms and definitions, or different classifications. The beauty of official statistics is that it aims to be the single national source of trusted information for multiple purposes. This includes the aim to informing disaster risk management with evidence-based data, which were turned into high-quality statistics following internationally agreed criteria. Let me also mention here the importance of the fundamental principles of official statistics, which were developed by ECE 30 years ago and adopted by the UN Statistical Commission in 1994. Official statistics are still not yet always fit for the purpose of informing disaster risk management. Therefore, it's so important to learn from existing national experiences and to have a common statistical framework available which helps national statistical systems and their partners from disaster risk management authorities to develop national data sets which are coherent with each other, consistent over time, and internationally comparable. We will now listen to 2 country experiences, one from a national statistical office and another from a disaster risk reduction organization. Thereafter, there are 2 very specific presentations, one on the importance of disaggregated data and the other on the statistical review of the hazard definition and classification. If you have questions to the speakers, please post them in the chat. We will first listen to the presentations and I will then pick a few questions and address them to the speakers. And I would like to remind speakers of the 7 minutes time limit that was given. I could hear that Animesh has already started introducing Vivian Ilarina, who is currently the Assistant National Statistician handling the Macroeconomic Account Service under the Secretarial Statistics Office of the Philippine Statistics Authority. She earned her master's degree on Socioeconomic Information on Environmental Natural Resources in ITC in the Netherlands. As an assistant national statistician, she manages the generation, compilation, analysis, and dissemination of the economic accounts, as well as the satellite accounts on disaster, digital, tourism, health, ocean, environmental, and so on. She serves as a member of various interagency committees on statistics in the Philippines, which involves developing methodologies and addressing data problems in the generation, dissemination, use of official statistics. Vivian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that kind introduction. So good day, everyone. And my presentation will focus on strengthening disaster statistics towards developing the disaster risk reduction expenditure accounts for informed risk development. And this is the case of the Philippines. So I will talk about, on the next slide, I will talk about why disaster statistics in the Philippines and our initiative in developing these accounts. What are the framework, data sources, data and methodologies, and how do we ensure that we institutionalize this data support available for the accounts. And I will do a presentation of quickly on the key findings about the initial results, and also finally a summary or some key messages. Next slide. Of course, the Philippines is an archipelago country, and we are very much vulnerable to disasters, to hazardous events, mostly typhoons, floods, earthquakes, and so on. And the Philippines, according to the report of the World Risk Index of 2021, ranks six among those 181 countries in terms of the risk. So that we feel that disaster statistics and further to the disaster accounts, this is a very important tool for the countries to support the country's national priorities for effective disaster risk reduction and management. Because mainly as a manager to reduce risk, disaster risk, this is mainly to protect human lives and infrastructure, and also to conserve our environmental and natural resources. So the disaster statistics can really demonstrate how investments in disaster reduction, in the case of the DRRE accounts, will not only save lives, but will also help reduce poverty. So for the Philippines, these concerns are all embodied in the Philippine Development Plan, in our long-term vision for 2040, and even on the President's 10-point socio-economic agenda. So they are, in one way or another, integrated. On the next slide, please. So because of this, it is very important that we need to inform those decisions, inform the decision, especially the disaster risk reduction managers, to really provide that tool. And this tool are related to the progress, to monitor progress, to actionable priorities. Of course, the Philippines is one signatory in the Sendai Framework and also in the Sustainable Development for 2030 in terms of the Sustainable Development Indicators. On the next slide, then our initiative started in 2017 when we participated as member of the Intergovernmental Expert Working Group under the UNDRR, and also we participated in terms of the development of the Sendai Framework also under the UNDRR in 2017. And the following year, 2018, we participated in the pilot project of the UN ESCAP. These are we have participated along with other countries like Fiji, Bangladesh, and Indonesia And then after 2 years, we tried to look at some of the statistics that are available to monitor the framework of the disaster. And initially in 2018, we have found out that there are only 33% that are available disaster statistics that can support the framework. So we go further into establishing a technical working group, and we also started doing a compilation to move forward the disaster account statistics. And in 2020, we expand our coverage not only to cover the government, but also to cover expenditures of households and to cover expenditure of corporations. Starting 2021, we ensure that all these data are available for us regularly. So we have the community-based monitoring system. We incorporated the disaster data here, and also in the 2021 family income expenditure surveys. And we ask the household how much expenditures they have incur during the disaster. And this is something new in the Philippines statistical system. Next slide will show you the framework that we use. This is the DRSF. Of course, this is very important because it provides us a better analysis of the occurrence of disaster that will result in more effective disaster reduction risk management. And in terms of the statistics that supports this framework, so we have information like statistics before the disaster on the next slide, or statistics during the disaster, and statistics after the disaster. So these are all integrated in the DRSF. On the next slide, and this is now the focus of some of the accounts that we are developing. This is more on the expenditures that the government use or utilize to mitigate disaster, to prepare for the disaster, and also to do impact evaluation after the disaster. So it comes from different forms. These expenditures coming within the government that is transferred to the local government, or expenditures by the government coming from the international as transfers from the ODA, overseas development assistance, and other sources of expenditure. So we put all this data together. It's not a perfect data, but available data from the government is more or less fairly well developed in the case of the government. Next slide. So we tried to look at how much is the total expenditure of the government and also the private. And we tried to look, delineate them whether are the public expenditure more, are they spending more in terms of the disaster, or the private also how much exactly are they contributing to the government. Next slide. Also, we tried to look at the different expenditures in terms of how much expenditures we are spending to prevent and mitigate disaster, and how much we are spending to establish or strengthen the capacities of the population or the government, and also in terms of the disaster response and the disaster rehabilitation and recovery. And then we can look at also how much expenditures are really current expenditures and how much of them are fixed capital formation or investments. So these are some of the approaches that we tried to look at in the accounts of the expenditure in disaster. Next slide. So these are the list of data sources that we have. Mostly these are coming from the government, like the Commission on Audit, Department of Budget, the National Economic and Development Authority, the Office of the Civil Defense. So this comes in the form of the financial statements, also from the National Risk Reduction Agency in the form of their actual expenditures or the number of affected population. In the Philippine Statistics Authority, my office, we are also generating general purpose statistics like census of population, households, expenditures, community-based monitoring, and so on. So these are indirectly some of the data that we are using. Put them together in one database, so and then provide them in a framework, DRSF, and look at the story in terms of expenditures by the government on disaster. Next slide. Okay. Uh, we realized when we started developing disaster statistics in the Philippine Statistics Authority that data are not really that very much available. They are not readily available simply because they are available but they are not processed. They are not in the form that we wanted as user of this data. They are there, but it's not really harnessed. So we tried to provide some a mechanism how to ensure that we can institutionalize this data on a regular basis, possibly annual or quarterly. So we develop or establish a technical working group on disaster statistics. This is created by the Philippine Statistics Authority under the Interagency Committee on Environment Statistics, and these are mostly focused on trying to address how to produce this data, use the data, and disseminate the disaster statistics. Also, we have the Philippine Council on Disaster Risk Reduction Management. This is created by the Disaster Management Agency, but this is not focused more on the statistics, but these are more focused on policies, programs, interventions, and so on. We have another set of mechanism, the Philippine Statistical Development Plan. Every term of the president, every 6 years, we try to map out what are the priority statistical programs, what are the priority statistical activities, and we put them together in the different chapters. And this is something that we need to monitor and which agency is responsible to produce that. And then one among them also is the Philippine Statistics Authority is a coordinator and the lodging house of the 155 indicators that we are monitoring in the Philippines under the Sustainable Development Goals. And also we assist in terms of supporting the data for the Sendai Framework. Of course, because we are committed for the SDGs and also for the Sendai Framework as a country. Next slide. Okay, just to show you briefly some of the results. So we have the latest that we have, it's 2019, simply because data are not really that readily available or timely. So we have a lag time of like 2 years or 1 year. So, but while data are not yet really final and they are not really that strong enough, this indication we saw a story. In the Philippines, the expenditures by the government, by the households, and by the corporations, the expenditures are increasing over time. But when you look at this expenditure and compare them to the expenditures of the gross domestic product, it is only 1%. But the trend is increasing, which we say, okay, this is something that is a favorable indicator, because that means that we are more active in terms of addressing problems or reducing the risk of the disaster. Next slide. This one, we look at also how much is the expenditure of public and private. We saw that public spends 78%, while the private spends 22%. But in terms of the average, of course, we saw that the private is also increasing up to, in the average, 27%. Next slide. So this one is trying to look at expenditures in terms of the expenditures on management of disaster, on the recovery for disaster, or prevention and mitigation of disaster. So the results for 2019 is that we are spending 47% of the total expenditures more for the disaster prevention and mitigation. And then this is followed by 31% spending for recovering after the disaster, and also 20% in terms of managing this disaster. Next slide.
Sorry, Vivian, could you sum up in 1 minute, please?
Yes. Okay. So this is, I think, the last two slides. So this is just an investment in disaster and the current expenditure in disaster. Next slide. Yeah, this is the investment. 85.2% is investing on disaster. Next slide. Okay, so this is the last slide. So there are a lot of lessons learned, no, while we develop this disaster statistics and also the accounts. So we need a standard concepts, definitions, classifications, and we need to address the reporting and the problem on data gaps, and also to train people, the compilers, the producers, and users of these disaster statistics, and of course, to engage with the development partners like UNSCAP, UNSE, UNDRR, and so on. So this ends my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vivian, for this excellent presentation. And I think this presentation of how you identified expenditures for prevention and mitigation, I think it's not always an easy task. And I think others can really learn from this excellent experience that you and your colleagues have. It was also interesting to hear from the governance aspect of your work. So actually, the role of this technical working group and other mechanisms that you have to integrate the Statistics Authority into the landscape of the relevant governmental stakeholders. So I think this is really, really interesting and encouraging also for other countries. I think we can learn a lot from that. And last but not least, I think it was very good to hear that the ESCAP disaster-related statistics framework provides an important foundation for what you're doing. I think this also should be reemphasized here and promoted here. So thank you very much for these insights. And colleagues, if you have any questions to Vivian, please feel free to post them in the chat, and Vivian, you can respond in writing, or we can come back to this also later on in talking. But let's come to the next presentation. So it will be Teresa Pinto, who is the National Director of Administration and Finance at the Instituto Nacional de Gestão e Redução do Risco de Desastres in Mozambique. Teresa holds a bachelor's degree in international relations and diplomacy with 12 years of experience working in disaster risk reduction. She's an experienced professional in disaster risk management and climate change, and has a profound track record in project management, establishment and management of partnerships, monitoring, evaluation, reporting. She has been advising the executive management, coordinating the disaster risk reduction stakeholders, and leading resource mobilization efforts. For the period 2017 to 2020, she was in charge of coordinating the process of monitoring the Sendai Framework in Mozambique as a disaster risk reduction focal point. So Teresa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Naji, and afternoon everyone, and good morning. My presentation will be focused on disaster risk reduction in Mozambique. Next slide, please. So Mozambique is one of African countries most vulnerable to extreme weather and climate events. And the most hazard that we face is floods, epidemics, cyclones, and the droughts. And these extreme events shows the trend of increase in terms of frequency and intensity over the last decades. Next slide, please. The National Institute for Disaster Risk Management is the government institution responsible for coordinating the disaster risk reduction action in Mozambique, such as disaster risk prevention and mitigation, emergency management and response, development of arid and semi-arid zone, post-disaster reconstruction, coordinate the National Civil Protection Unit and the Strength, Resilience and Disaster Risk Management programs. Next slide, please. These are the disaster risk management mechanisms. In general, the national mechanism for coordinate and guide the policy and disaster risk reduction is a multi-sectoral and interdisciplinary with a public, private, and civil society participation. If you see, we have the Council of Ministers at the top, then we have the Council of Coordinated Council, then we have INGD, National Institute for Disaster Management, responsible for the coordinate of all the action of disaster risk reduction. Next slide, please. This graph shows the increase of disaster, the number of disasters since 2018. And if you see, we have a growing rate of floods and epidemic dominate the decade of 20th century. But now we have an increase of floods and cyclones. Next slide, please. On this graph, we can see the trend of the increase of frequency and the intensity of tropical cyclones in Mozambique. The map shows the different cyclones that hit Mozambique. Next slide. With the data that are available, we used to prepare this kind of maps, risk maps. The first maps, we have the risk floods, then the cyclones and droughts. Next map. Next slide, please. So as you know, a few weeks ago, we have a tropical storm that hit Mozambique on 24th January and landfall in Nampula province and affect the Zambezia, Nampula, Tete, Niassa, and Sofala in Cabo Delgado province. This storm brought heavy rainfall and he hit Angoche. He hit Angoche, district of Nampula province, and affect more than 185,000 people in Mozambique, and we have confirmed 38 people deaf. We use the data to prepare this kind of information that helps for the decision makers. Please, next slide. And these are some achievements on implementation of DRR programs. We have a DRR master plan approved. We have a disaster risk reduction fund. We have also the disaster risk reduction law, a strategy for adaptation and mitigation. It's ongoing now, the development of flood and cyclone information flow strategy, a disaster risk reduction local community operation strategy, a financial protection strategy, and disaster risk insurance, and other strategies. Next slide. We also bring some challenge, the lack of access of funds, challenge on getting specific data to support decision making, challenge on equipment and capacity building, challenge to involve the private sector on DRR programs and response. We also have some reflections that for align DRR issue with a main public policy, support and invest more in preparedness at all levels, national and provincial and district level. And thank you. These are some information about disaster risk reduction that I have to share with you. Thank you, Mr. Nashi.
Thank you very much, Teresa. So I think many of the issues that you have listed as challenges are not unique to Mozambique, but I think they're kind of universal. And I think interesting was also to see the second point that you had on the list of challenges was the obtaining the right data for decision making. So I wonder, and maybe we can come back to this later in the discussion, how the involve an integration of statistical information, how the collaboration with the statistical office also works in that regard with the disaster risk authority. So thank you, Teresa, for highlighting the specific situation and the challenges in your country. And I think we can come back to this later on to discuss a little bit more in detail.
Thank you.
Questions. Thank you so much. Let me come to our next speaker, which is Ms. Sara Duerto Valero, who is the Regional Advisor on Gender Statistics in UN Women's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, where she manages the flagship program initiative Making Every Woman and Girl Count, as well as the regional program Building Back Better on gender statistics. Besides planning and implementing interventions to support the quality, availability, and use of gender statistics across Asia and the Pacific, she provides technical advice and prepare analytical materials on gender statistics. Before joining the regional office, she worked as a statistics specialist in UN Women's headquarters. Previously, Sarah was a statistician at the Statistics Division of the United Nations Secretariat, the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, and UNESCO's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. She holds a master's degree in development studies from the Université Libre de Brussels and graduate degree on business from Universidad de Zaragoza. In her free time, she enjoys traveling, arts, and the ocean. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's really nice to be with all of you here today. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to be talking about how do we integrate a gender perspective across disaster and climate change statistics. So even though I'm going to be talking about gender, obviously very similar points can be made for disaggregation across many other dimensions. So it's kind of interchangeable. So next slide, please. First, I'm going to talk about why is a gender angle important. So, you know, often when we work very closely with countries, etc., and we talk about disaster statistics, climate change statistics from a gender angle, the answer that we get is, well, disasters affect everyone. So why the gender perspective? And the answer is really because we really need to know what's happening to women and men differently in order to provide holistic responses, right? So it's possible that more women or more men may be dying depending on the location of a hazard, of a disaster. It's possible, like we know, for instance, from different conflict settings, etc., that when women and men migrate in displacement settings, women tend to take the children with them, so they have very different needs in that regard, for instance. We know that women are a lot less likely to own assets such as land or financial assets, and therefore, you know, they encounter more barriers to cope with some of these crises. We know there are massive differences in terms of time use. For instance, when a crisis happens, we see that women tend to tell us that they increase dramatically the time they spend cooking, cleaning, etc., while men tend to see increases in the time that they spend, you know, fixing any damage in their homes, for instance, or taking care of animals, etc. So large differences there, as well as regarding participation in decision making, either in, you know, environmental decision making or shelter management or forest committees or whatever it might be. Next slide, please. So it is important to measure these issues, but how do we measure these issues? Next slide. So we have two options. We can either look at some of the existing indicator sets, such as the SDGs or the Sendai Framework, etc., and disaggregate the data, which is obviously a very good option and kind of like an easier first step. And then we have option number two, which is really, even if we took all the frameworks that you see there on the screen, you started disaggregating the data by sex and age and many other, overlapping characteristics, we would still not be capturing a lot of these gender issues that I mentioned in my first slide. So there is really a need to actually look at the indicators that are on these frameworks and think about whether these indicators are really speaking to the needs of women and girls, or of people of older age or younger age, or disabled people with disabilities, etc. So in Asia and the Pacific, we actually had a series of intergovernmental discussions to look at some of these indicators and see what's needed. And what member states told us is that we needed to add some indicators regarding some of the topics that were missing, like women in environmental conservation roles, like gender differentials in environmental related displacement or environmental related conflict, etc. Large lists, right? But beyond having these indicators, how do we actually move on to starting the measurement, right? So next slide, please. So we have two main options, I guess, which is we either use some of the data that we already have, or we collect new data. So we started doing a little bit of both. So in UN Women, we started looking at some demographic and health survey data and integrating it with geospatial data. And with that, we ran multivariate logistic regression and random forest models to look at what happened. And what happened is that this model showed that drought episodes, flood risk, aridity index, increases in temperature, distance to lake, distance to oceans, all these variables were important to explain the risk of several gender-related outcomes like child marriage rates, adolescent birth rates, intimate partner violence, lacking access to clean water, lacking access to clean fuels, which aren't directly gender issues. The last two don't speak directly about women, but really because women are disproportionately in charge of collecting water when the water is not available at home, or collecting fuels. This affects them disproportionately. So you see that, I just included a couple of examples on the screen to kind of make the point, but it's quite obvious across the board when you run this analysis. In the left, the bar graph, you can see child marriage rates are higher across arid clusters in all countries, or almost all countries. On the right, you see a map of Timor-Leste as an example. The blue dots also indicate aridity index. So the darker the blue is more humid, and the lighter the blue is more arid. And the yellow dots are high rates of intimate partner violence. So you see there an association between aridity and intimate partner violence. So of course there can be a million causes. We're only looking at correlation here. But in arid settings, we know that normally in arid clusters, like agricultural yield tend to be lower, economic stresses tend to be higher, and families sometimes choose to marry their girls off. Or we also know that in situations of economic stress, intimate partner violence tends to increase. So interesting connections that we can see just by looking at the data that we already have. Next slide. And then option number 2 is to actually go ahead and collect data on some of all these very important issues to really understand the connections between gender and the environment. So we put together a model questionnaire for countries that are interested in collecting this data, and we are supporting several countries with data collection already. So we put together this model questionnaire in consultation with FAO, ILO, IUCN, UNSCAP, UNEP, UNDRR, and SPC. Each of them with their different expertise would contribute to different parts of the questionnaire. The questionnaire has 10 modules, 2 of which are household level modules, and the rest are individual level modules, meaning that for the individual level modules, we need the respondents to be 1 adult male and 1 adult female per household. We want to avoid a proxy respondent in order to capture gender issues appropriately. So this model questionnaire covers all kinds of topics on gender and the environment. So anything from disaster exposure to climate change and preparedness to climate change, to the effects of all of that, to employment in the green economy, agriculture, environmentally related livelihoods, which includes, fisheries and forestry and all those things, asset ownership and thus capacity to cope with some of these hazards, decision making on environmental related issues, mobility, transportation, all kinds of things. So it's a very long questionnaire. Countries can choose to run it as a standalone, which is what Mongolia recently did. They recently finalized their first nationally representative survey on gender and the environment. Or they can choose whichever modules are interesting to them and attach them to other multi-purpose surveys that are sampled in an appropriate way. So since we're talking about disasters here, for instance, the module on disasters would include the list of hazards that was developed by UNDRR and partners. Many of you are in the call today. We would ask somebody, for instance, whether they experienced any of this hazard in the past 12 months. And if they say yes, for each of the hazards, we ask a series of questions regarding whether, what did they do to prepare for this hazard? Did they move their animals to a drier place? Did they buy medicines, whatever? Some questions about what happened after the hazard, were they sick? Did they lose their jobs? Did their child stop going to school? Did they saw increases in the time they allocate to unpaid domestic work, etc.? And then we have some questions about whether they participate in related decision making. So that's just for disasters, but there's, as I said, then there's other questions on climate change. There's other questions on fisheries and what do people do with fishing gear, how do they discard of it, or whether they report bycatch, all kinds of details around many topics. So I won't get into this, but you can find the questionnaire on our website if you're interested in exploring a little bit. So as I said, Mongolia already completed the survey. Bangladesh completed in some select regions. We're working with Samoa to roll it out in June and the Solomon Islands shortly after. And we have several countries that have expressed interest already for support next year. So we're working hard on trying to generate some of this data. Next, please. And then obviously the obvious kind of like next step besides generating the data is to make sure that the data that we have is actually used. And sometimes it's a matter of really reprocessing the data and generating some estimates in a way that's easy to consume by people. So we've been working also really hard with countries in the Pacific, in the ASEAN region, etc., to reprocess some of their data and generate reports. We're about to launch a report that you see there next week on sustainable energy in the Pacific. We launched another report, the ASEAN Gender Outlook, that's already available since last year. That includes a lot of environment-related indicators. So I encourage you to take a look if you have time and interest. And next slide, please. And then I just wanted to flag this link here, which this is not my work. This is the work of our colleagues that work on policy, right? So in UN Women, we work both on policy and on data. And we find it's very important that the data that's produced actually gets used for decision making and policy making. So our policy colleagues are working very hard on this new platform, which is Women's Resilience to Disaster. It's a knowledge hub that includes a lot of knowledge products on the topic of women resilience and women's disasters, and with a heavy focus on the Pacific. And it has lots and lots of very interesting resources. So I encourage you to go and visit it if you get a chance as well. Finally, last slide, just sharing with you my email address and the link to data.unwomen.org, where you can find a lot of these products if you're interested. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for this excellent presentation, and also re-emphasizing the importance of looking at different disaggregations actually of data which is related to disasters, and specifically the gender issue. You mentioned the importance of gender differences concerning vulnerability and also the different ways of responding to disasters. Very interesting was to see, of course, this close relationship between violence and vulnerability to hazards. You said it's a correlation. It's not necessarily causal, but maybe more data is needed to analyze further how it comes to this pattern on the map that you showed. It was very interesting to see that. And I think it was also interesting to learn about the UN Women's tools that you have developed to support countries in developing questionnaires, either using them as a standalone questionnaire or to have some modules that can be added onto existing surveys, such as household surveys, for example. So I think this was a lot of interesting and very useful information that you have given there. You also mentioned some reports and guidance documents, so maybe you can post also links to these documents in the chat so that participants can access them directly. And yes, to the audience, so if you have any questions to the speakers, please feel free to post them in the chat. I hope the chat function is operational so that we can use them also for the discussion later on. And last but not least, I would like to introduce our next speaker, who is Kanza Ahmed. who is a consultant in global health for the Global Disaster Risk Reduction and Global Health Security teams at the newly formed United Kingdom Health Security Agency, which was previously known as the Public Health England. Kansa has extensive experience of epidemiology and statistics, having graduated from the UK Field Epidemiology Training Program in 2020. She is currently leading the disaster-related statistics pilot on behalf of the Interagency Expert Group and the Task Force on Measuring Hazardous Events and Disasters. Kansa is also part of the successful bid team for the joint Health Security and Office for National Statistics Climate Change Statistics project, securing £5 million from the Wellcome Trust to work with partners in Africa on developing climate change-related statistics and models. She was also part of the team responsible for leading the delivery of the recently published UNDRR International Science Council Hazard Definition and Classification Supplement. She earned her first master's degree in economics and philosophy at the University of St Andrews in Scotland and completed her master's in international public health at the University of Birmingham. She is also an honorary lecturer at Keele Medical School in England, and she will enlighten us now about the review of the hazard classification. Over to you, Kansa.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody on the call. And thank you very much for joining us. I think it's quite fitting that this one has come last, because I think it sums up the issues and the challenges that has been raised by Teresa, Vivian, and Sarah, and hopefully we can show how we're intending to build upon some of the things that they have brought up in their presentations. So on the next slide, I just want to bring to give you the background and what it is that we're talking about. So let's start with the foundation. How did this come about? On the next slide, you can see that all of this is built upon the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. So the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction tells us that actually we should be taking an all hazards approach. And of course, realistically, when it comes to definitions, people are asking, well, what do we mean by all hazards? So the Hazard Definition and Classification Review went one step further and actually gave a definition of all hazards and actually listed 302 hazards. And this list was whittled down from several thousand that my colleague, Professor Virginia Murray, and others helped UN agencies and other scientific colleagues to whittle this list down. So in October last year, we actually published these hazard information profiles, and what they do is they provide a scientific and academic definition for each of the hazards. And this effectively is really important because for the first time we're working towards a global definition for these particular hazards, and it means that actually we're talking with a unified language when we describe a particular hazard. And all of this work is underpinned by the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the International Health Regulations as well, and as well as research frameworks. So we've got these hazard information profiles, but what can we actually do with them? Well, on the next slide, we'll talk a bit more around how they can be used operationally. So the hazard information profiles, those definitions will enable better understanding. So if I talk to you about a certain type of flood, my colleagues in disaster risk reduction in different countries will say, yes, I know exactly what you mean. And what that then does is it helps inform policy. And that's really important so that we can understand what it is that we need to do in order to be able to tackle those hazards. But finally, and what came up in Vivian's presentation earlier, is the financial element. By having clearer definitions, we are then able to be talking the same language, develop a policy, and be able to develop approaches to have better funding in order to develop interventions. But all of this is only possible if we have good disaster-related statistics, because we need to understand what is the true burden of those hazards. And the UN Statistical Commission, on the next slide, I've taken a quote of the UN Statistical Commission around the importance of disaster-related statistics. Why is it important? Well, we've heard that already from Vivian, from Zara, from Teresa in their presentations. There is a real need within countries and at the UN level to have better data and statistical measurement. And it's important that we have that because we want to improve the understanding of disaster risk reduction, and that helps us to have better resilience and preparedness. So with all that in mind, and that's the background, we've gone over to developing a disaster-related statistics pilot. And so the background for this pilot, I've just The hazard information profiles provide us the academic and scientific background, but what we want to do is use them to develop a statistical background. So on the next slide, just to explain a bit more around the pilot background, what the hazard information profiles do is they provide a common set of hazard definitions, and it was recommended that we use these as the basis to develop statistical definitions and working with national
Kansa, we are losing you from time to time, at least on my end. If you can hear me, maybe you want to turn off the video to get a better connection.
Can you hear me now, Michael?
I can hear you, yes. I'm not sure, maybe it's just on my end, but okay, please continue, Kansa.
So on the next slide, just want to talk about the primary objective of the disaster-related statistics pilot.
Kansa, I think we have a problem with your connection. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, because I also get a confirmation from other colleagues that you're freezing for everyone. But okay, now we can hear you. Please continue.
Okay, I've switched my camera off, so hopefully that might work a little bit better now. So apologies for that. So the primary objective of the disaster-related statistics pilot is to provide feedback from a statistical point of view about the applicability of the hazard information profiles. So what it will do is it'll provide an important understanding of whether we can develop statistical definitions, and that will help in order to develop practical implementation and guidelines. So what methodology are we using? On the next slide, I'm just outlining what we're taking. So there are three elements to this. There's a systematic review by experts, there is a voluntary pilot testing, and there is a literature review going on. So the literature review is being conducted and looking at what information is out there at the moment around statistical definitions. But the systematic review and the voluntary pilot testing are really important because there's a new element. So systematic review, what we're looking at is actually getting a group of experts together to understand more about the hazards and statistical definitions and what works and what doesn't work. The voluntary pilot testing goes down the route of actually looking at what works within countries. So the things that Vivian and Teresa talked about, they will come under that. So what is it actually in terms of the challenges around developing statistical definitions, and how can we support and understand that better? So the research question that we're looking at is on the next slide, is effectively we're asking how effective are the current data collection and collation systems at providing accurate figures for the global targets. We already heard from Sarah how important that is, that we have better accurate definitions, and that's really important so that we have an understanding of the true global burden of disease. So how's a systematic review going to happen? On the next slide, very quickly, I'm just going to outline the process that we're using. So we've already got an initial group of interested experts, but I do want to open the floor out to people and say we do want you on board, and we do encourage you to complete the survey. The survey link is in the slides, and we can put that into the chat as well. We want to identify as many experts as possible in this area who can actually look at the hazard information profiles and actually give us their expertise in terms of the structure and the classification, how complete it is, and how easy it is to then develop a statistical and epidemiological definition from those that is both usable and used within the countries. Now, from the voluntary pilot testing side of the pilot, On the next slide, the research question for the countries is, how do countries capture the data for the first 4 global targets, the Sendai Framework, for their chosen hazards, and what challenges do they face? So effectively, on the next slide, just to tell what the objective of the voluntary pilot testing is that we're asking countries to select hazards that are relevant to them. And what we're asking them to do is work with colleagues from the health background, from meteorological offices, etc., to identify what data exists. And I think I was really struck by Vivian's point that actually sometimes it was difficult to understand who had that data and whether the data is in the right format, etc. So that's the question we're asking. How easy is it to access that data in order to develop a statistical definition, and how accurate is it, and what gaps are there? So what's the governance structure of this project? On the next slide, just to quickly outline how we're sort of monitoring this project and the outcomes. The interagency expert group on disaster-related statistics is overseeing this project, and we are reporting to them on a quarterly basis. But we also have a project team that meet on a weekly basis that's led by myself, with Michael from UNECE and Daniel Clark from OECD. Just finally want to run you through the timelines and our plans when you can actually see the outcomes of this. So in the next couple of months, we are asking yourselves to come and get involved. We want to hear more about your opinion is, whether it's contributing through the survey or whether it's contributing through the expert focus groups. And once we've collected all that data, we're aiming to then have a report published around April time, so that in May we can share the outcomes at the UNDRR global platform. So my final slide is a call for action. Really want to encourage you to be involved. And why should you be involved? Why should you be investing your time to support this project and supporting the development of disaster-related statistics? Well, it's an opportunity for you to influence the process, to engage stakeholders and to gain buy-in. We can utilise your expertise to develop statistical definitions, because at the end of the day, you're the ones who are responsible for making these work within your countries. And finally, it's an opportunity for yourselves to contribute to the development of a new field of disaster-related science, and to use your expertise to take that further. So that's the project in a summary, and I do apologise for the tech issues at this end, which I knew were going to end up happening, but thank you very much for taking the time to listen to the presentation.
Thank you very much, Kansa. In the end, it worked very well. It was just a few minutes, which were a bit difficult to hear you. But just in a nutshell, I think what you have presented here is really an important piece of work that not everyone is aware of yet that this exists. So I think we should use every opportunity to promote this work. And I think it's so important because it really helps to integrate the data from different sources that we have. We're trying to talk the same technical language in terms of hazards, right? When we talk about a hazard, what do we really mean? We know that, for example, slow onset disasters like a drought, it's sometimes very difficult to define it from a temporary point of view, but also from a spatial point of view. And we hope that with this pilot testing, we will get more recommendations and more answers on how to do it actually, so the data becomes not only comparable within countries, but also becomes internationally comparable and can help them really towards evidence-based decision making. And we know we are talking about the same thing. Thank you for this, Kansa, and please post also in the chat the links that you mentioned. So I'm sure there are experts out there who might be interested to contribute to this very important exercise and also share their views and experience. I haven't seen any questions in the chat so far, unless I have missed something. Then colleagues, please, Rahul or Animesh or Rike, please let me know if I've missed something. But so please feel free to post questions if you have some. We still have a few minutes left so that our experts can respond to them. But while we are waiting for questions, maybe I would like to ask all of our speakers, according to the experience, and we have now heard from different views, from a national statistical office, from a disaster risk agency, and then from the international point of view, in an ideal world, what would be the contributions of the national statistical system to risk analysis? We've heard about impact assessment. We also heard some elements about measuring vulnerability. And of course, we know that the expertise and the hands-on work is usually with disaster risk management authorities in the countries. These are the ones actually managing disaster risk management in a country. This is their role. But we also, I think, have heard from all the presentations that official statistics provides a very important foundation for this work, because there is experience in producing this information. Lots of information is produced for multiple purposes. And I would like to hear from our presenters what they believe really the role should be of national statistical systems in informing risk management. So what should be really within this package and what is not in this package of national statistical offices. So maybe we can make a very quick tour de table from starting with maybe with Vivian, to let us know, based on her experience, what really the role of the National Statistical Office should be in that regard to lead towards better risk management in countries and literally to save lives.
Okay.
Vivian.
Yes, thank you, Michael. Actually, from the point of view of the statistical office, it is very important that you need to translate all these needs of the disaster risk managers into data. Try to understand it very well. Try to operationalize them. A lot of these words, as you mentioned, are sometimes vague. It has to be clearly defined so that we can put statistics on them. So we can go to the field, how to collect this data if these are clearly defined. Second, this engagement of the statistical office cannot be done only by itself. It would need that expertise from the disaster management agency. So it's really a partnership, not only from the statistical agencies. So and then we should need, of course, the framework. The framework is very important. A lot of data are available. They are scattered. We say they are very weak. They are less quality. But when you put them in one framework, you will be able to see, what are the weaknesses, the strength, and what are the gaps. So these are, I'm sure, very necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vivian. So yes, you re-emphasized again the importance of partnerships. And I think what we learned from a presentation is also that such a mechanism exists in the Philippines and could be used as a kind of model for other countries, so that the different partners can actually talk to each other and find ways to inform the information needs that policy have. So thank you for that. There is a discussion going on in the chat between Kansa and one of the listeners, so there's something be clarified now. We will come back to this in a minute. But in the meantime, I would like to ask Teresa Pinto, because you also mentioned from the Mozambique point of view that there is a need for better data. Do you have any suggestions how official statistics could help you in that situation, or what kind of data would you need for better informing risk management, Teresa?
Thank you. I think it's important that the national statistics get more involved in this NDRR action, sharing with us a knowledge how to collect this data. It's important also to them to bring this data to make some analysis and to deliver for all the stakeholders in the country. For now, for us, now we are not producing a data for the statistic sector. We are just bring this data and just deliver for the university, but the statistics they are not doing anything with this data. So I think they have to be more involved in these actions. As a partner of a DRR sector.
Thank you very much. So this also calls for let's say a formal mechanism where actually the partners can talk and exchange experience and also exchange what is really needed to inform the policies. So I think this is again kind of re-emphasizing also what the experience of the Philippines is in that regard. We have a raised hand from Shoko from Japan. I'm not sure if we can give the floor for a minute to raise the question. It probably goes to Kansa. I'm not sure, Shoko, if you can unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Shoko speaking. So as I put a message in the chat box, but our concern is if the details classification is provided, maybe we will make confusion. So we want to know how the confusion can be decreased if the details classification is provided.
Thank you. Kansa, is this something where you could respond to?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. And I think, it's a very valid point that I think people are being bombarded with definitions, classifications, frameworks, etc. And there's a lot of confusion for colleagues in Offices for National Statistics and other organisations to say, well, OK, what definition are we using and what do we mean? The purpose of the hazard information profiles is to go one step forward and to take away some of that confusion, because we know there's multiple definitions that exist, but if you work towards a single definition, that means that within your country or across different countries, we all know we're working to the same classification. That should, over time, reduce the amount of confusion rather than at the moment. So if we take, for example, I was talking to colleagues in the humanitarian side who were saying that what they found is that they go in if there's been a disaster like a cyclone or whatever, and they are working to definition, but actually they find out later on that they were using a different definition to certain diseases or for certain incidents compared to other humanitarian colleagues. And so it creates problems within, the delivery of that support. So by actually going down the route of creating these definitions, it means we have a single definition for particular hazards. And that means then actually within your country, for the Office of Statistics and disaster-related disaster risk reduction colleagues are able to talk the same language. But yes, whilst we have this interim situation when these definitions are being implemented, there is bound to be confusion. And that's why we are going down this route to try to publicise and promote this in as many places as possible, so people are using the same language going forward.
Thank you very much, Kansa, for clarifying this. I hope this answers the question that we got from the colleague from Japan. I don't see any new questions so far, and actually we are coming to the end of this panel discussion. But since the event is still going on, if there are more questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. And maybe our distinguished speakers can also reply in the chat while this meeting is still ongoing, if there are more questions. And yes, maybe let me sum up very quickly my take-home messages from what we've just heard, presentation discussions. And I would sum up for myself that the presentation showed there is lots of experience out there in producing the necessary information in risk analysis, but also in post-disaster assessment. At the same time, it seems that not all related policy questions and questions of managers and decision makers can be informed satisfyingly yet. There is a need to strengthen capacity and governance on national level, and to have international guidance and frameworks for harmonizing the production of the information. The establishment of the Interagency and Expert Group on Disaster-Related Statistics has been an important step forward. Also, the setup of a regular expert forum where practitioners from national and international level can get together and share experience and discuss emerging needs. And this leads me to introducing the next speaker. I would like to be calling upon Ms. Wafa Abulhosen, who will provide a brief introduction to the upcoming second expert forum on disaster-related statistics. Wafa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for all the participants and their interest in the subject. I want to thank you, Michael, and our colleagues in UNSCAP and UNDRR for the tremendous amount of work that has been done on behalf of all the UN community on disaster-related statistics. I have a small presentation. I don't know if I can share it. Yes. So I'll be very brief. For those who joined us during the first expert forum in June last year, it was a forum. Next slide, please. Yes, next slide. So it was a forum organized by UNDRR, DESA, UNSD, and the regional commissions, and mainly by UNECE and ESCAP. We had a very good participation and subjects that were of importance to statistical offices and the DRR community. And the main issues that were discussed, we wanted to keep those themes and follow up on the main outcome of the first forum. So we, like in ESCWA, we proposed to host the next forum in Beirut, as ESCWA is the regional commission for Western Asia. We have, like all the regions, are not spared of any of the disasters. We all had our share of all kinds of disasters. So alternating the hosting of the expert forum was a good idea, so that countries can exchange information and share their experiences. So the next forum will allow for sharing best practices from countries across the region: Asia Pacific, Arab region, Europe, Africa, Latin America. And it will allow for looking at the coordination, what happened since the last forum, and how more and more agencies are coordinating among each others and with other stakeholders. We heard in the beginning with Animesh that there's the interagency and expert group, the task force on measuring hazardous events and disasters, the core group, the UNECE task force, and the ESCAP community of practice. You know, there are very important stakeholders also at the UN level and others like OCHA, WHO, WMO. In the Arab countries, the League of Arab States also had its own group on disasters. So, and of course, the UNEP and UNFCCC, especially that the climate summit in Glasgow last year and the upcoming one in Egypt this year will allow to really think about climate change, disaster-related statistics, and bringing all communities together. The next forum will also follow up on the statistical definitions, classifications, frameworks, and data sources. Yes, Kanza said everybody will be mixed up with all these frameworks, definitions, all that. But this is the bread and butter of statistical offices and methodologies, because like we said, we need to be able to compare across the countries and speak the same language, and as much as possible have like standards to be able to move this area forward. So there have been a lot of work since the first expert forum. Kanza mentioned the hazard definition and classification supplement. There's a very important upcoming framework on disaster-related statistics. A lot of work is being done on geospatial information and disaster statistics and climate change indicators, and our colleagues in DESA, UNSD, usually inform on this area. And also a lot of work, and we follow a lot on remote sensing and big data integration to census. And a lot of work is being done by Brazil, Mexico, Colombia. I heard last time I was participating at a NASA training, and Colombia presented a very nice presentation on how they are integrating census data with disasters affecting crops, etc. So the other also opportunity that the expert forum will bring is on leadership, communication, and partnerships. So we mentioned that statisticians and disaster risk management communities, but also we have the health, we have the climate change communities, and all these stakeholders need to communicate and share information and the data flows. And I would like to mention, for example, in Lebanon, we are coordinating with the UN country team and the resident coordinator officer to see how the data on floods, fires can be really linked, and the maps can be in one repository where everybody can use this information, so to have it ready in response cases and in management. Next slide, please. So the key themes that we addressed last time that we need to bring also on the table for the next forum, maybe with some additional ones. We mentioned health and disaster risk statistics. We're not over with COVID. We have to see, you know, with health, how the disaster risk statistics can help provide information for policy making. Climate change, also a very hot issue on the table that we need to bring together with statistical communities, especially on measurements and impacts. Official statistics, geospatial and big data for DRS, use of population and housing census. Unfortunately, many countries who have conducted population and household census and who have data that is geospatially with geospatial information are not really harnessing this wealth of information to integrate it with disaster statistics and remote sensing and all the new data available from technology and you know, from big data. What's important also, because it's in ESCAP, because we have many countries that are conflict affected, we would like to bring how difficult and how can countries in conflict come, you know, to bring the disaster-related statistics and what are the effects on population and what to do for recovery. So this can be a special session. Other things that are, you know, being undertaken by our sister agencies, UN Habitat, and a lot of work on cities and disaster risk statistics. We need to see that how official statistics at the city level can be localized and can inform on disaster risk reduction. Things that are not exactly related to official statistics, like understanding, we mentioned the economic effects on people, on infrastructure, on the economy. These are questions that we need to address. The economic cost can be very high on people and crops, on biodiversity, on direct and indirect effects. So this requires also partnerships, not only from statistical offices, but the ministries or the units working in disaster risk reduction, ministries of economies, ministries of finance. And we saw the presentation on the accounting, the framework for accounting. So we mentioned like how much a government can spend the expenditure of government on disaster risk reduction. But like we said, a lot has to be done on the economic cost and how to include it in the macroeconomics of a country. We thought maybe a drawing or a photo contest or a competition for children, and how, you know, how they see recovery after disaster can bring some humane and real experience of children and how much they suffer in disaster. Next slide. There might be new research questions and links to official statistics. The surveys that we send you, that our sister organizations send, it's to hear from you and to see how we can best serve the statistical community and the main stakeholders to provide better information, especially that we have all wealth of data sources that we can make use from. So thank you very much. That was short. And I leave it to Rike to see how to continue with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Wafa, and thanks for your constant and continuous contribution to this work, and of course not least thanks to you and colleagues at ESCAP for agreeing to host the second global expert forum on climate change statistics. I'm really looking forward to that, and just looking at the list of themes that I think would be the first outline of our program for that expert forum. I think there's a lot to look forward to. So thank you so much, Wafa. For those of you on the call who does not know me, my name is Rike Hansen. I work at ESCAP, and I have the pleasure of co-chairing together with Animesh Kumar from UNDRR, the global IAG that we have all heard quite a lot about during the past hour and a half, and it is in that capacity that I have the honor to close the side event today with a few remarks. I'm not going to try to summarize. First of all, we don't have enough time for that, but second of all, we've already had a few very good summary points made earlier by our moderator, Michael, and also Wafa, you've just managed to actually list quite a few of these very pertinent development issues that are so closely linked to being able to plan for better risk-informed development. So I think what would be a takeaway message is that a lot is happening. And the fact that this issue was taken up by the Statistical Commission means also that it has been possible for all of us who's involved in this to really pull global efforts together, because we now have global agencies and global intergovernmental bodies that are picking up the issue, and it makes it easier to coordinate. We see that there are efforts to develop statistical frameworks, to develop statistical classifications. We've heard of national efforts, regional efforts, global efforts. We've heard of different professional communities and different agencies coming together to really progress this this agenda. And what we heard at the very beginning is that one of the objectives, of course, with getting statistics developed in this area is for additional trust in the data, additional quality, and eventual the use. And when I say eventual, I want to also emphasize that we are engaging in this topic with some sense of urgency in a community that normally takes its time to develop statistical standards. We are very much aware that we are looking at very urgent development issues. We've heard from our speaker from Mozambique today that 60% of their population is exposed to at least 2 hazardous events every year. We've heard our speakers talk about issues related to climate change, to health, to gender. So we are not going to sit around and wait for the information and the statistics to be used. And I made a note that every single speaker today has actually talked about the use of the data, the need to train both users and producers, the need to be able to leverage the information and the statistics we have, even before it's all perfect and totally perfectly classified, etc. But we want and need this information to get into the policy space with some urgency. So while we still continue to work on the normative work, it is very important that we continue to showcase actual uses of disaster-related statistics for decision making. And this is one thing I will ask this community of putting some priority also going forward. So I want to also just mention one thing we've talked about. It came up in Sarah's presentation, the issue of disaggregating data, but we've also talked a lot about the need for classification. And why are we having those? It's actually so that we are all able to aggregate data. So let's not forget also that statistics is very much about aggregating. If we want to compare things over time, across countries, etc., we need to be able to sum things up and put them into categories and boxes that we all recognize and agree to the definitions of. Finally, I just wanted to mention the word governance. I don't want to get into detail. Michael very eloquently summarized the importance of this aspect of the disaster-related statistics sphere. So one last word on climate change, as was pointed out, both in some of the questions some of you raised and also from some of our speakers, it is a topic that's high on the development agenda, and it's obviously linked to disaster-related statistics. It has a lot to do with being clear about the definitions. And what I want to just remind all of you about is that for the upcoming session of the Statistical Commission, which starts the week after next, climate change related statistics is on the agenda. And I encourage all of you to listen in, if possible, to the discussions under that agenda item, because in the global set of climate change statistics that will be discussed, disasters are certainly represented. We can always discuss whether it's sufficiently or correctly represented, but this is exactly why there are deliberations on this. So I wish you all a very good session of the Statistical Commission, and I look forward to seeing you in future meetings of the IAG on disaster-related statistics and the expert forum, etc., etc. So thank you so much for listening in. It was a pleasure, and I was very happy to see that so many of you had registered and chosen to participate today. So with that, thank you, and until next time.